These past 8 months, when we talk about COVID and now the election, people say we are living in unprecedented times. And one thing's for sure, we are experiencing an unprecedented use of the word unprecedented. But is it really true? Is it unheard of to live in the midst of political turmoil and a full-blown plague? Hearing the word unprecedented strikes fear, doesn't it? If we've never been here before, what's going to happen? What will we do? And we keep asking, how do we cope with the tremendous uncertainty of our lives right now? We want to know, when will the virus end? When will we be safe again? And with Election Day on Tuesday, how do we cope with that uncertainty? I think right now most of us share a jittery, hypervigilant sense of alarm. But is the state of the world unprecedented? I know for a fact that many of you have lived through trauma, political upheaval in your home countries, political persecution here, suffering, personal suffering, suffering on a global scale. This is nothing new. And so, on this All Saints' Day 2020, we remember and honor the long line of humans who have come before us, making their way through suffering too, through wars and persecution and plagues. The great saints of the faith who stood up for what they believed in the midst of suffering. Also today, we honor our own loved ones, our parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and friends who have gone before, beloved saints who have changed our lives, and the still living saints we know now, showing us how to live. Last night, All Hallows Eve, that is, the evening of holy persons, is a traditional night of keeping vigil for these saints of the past. And today, All Saints' Day, we celebrate them and our connection to them. I love the idea of a spiritual connection between saints in heaven and all of us on earth, never stronger than on this day. Their lives informing our lives, their witness inspiring us, their example guiding us in the faith. Only sometimes saints can seem too good for us to follow. If anyone has ever called you a saint, you might also have heard in their voice a twinge of resentment, a wish for you to stop making the rest of us look bad. And you know, Dorothy Day, the great leader of the Catholic workers' movement, once said, "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily." And I bet our own Father Gregory Boyle here in LA feels the same way. Here is the good news, though. It turns out the threshold for sainthood is not quite as high as you would think. Remember, after all, what we know about the saints, about Jesus' disciples, for example, bumblers a lot of the time. And St. Francis, early on, a real spoiled brat. If you look at any life of any saint, human through and through, human, and not perfect. I think it's possible that saints inspire us because they're not perfect humans. They're humans like us, men and women longing to grow in closeness to God. While we're on the topic of impossible standards, the Beatitudes you heard Father John read just now, they can sound a little like that too, like a checklist of impossible traits. And if we're expected to follow a checklist like that, we know we're going to fail every day. Be meek, be merciful, be pure of heart, be persecuted. Who can sustain that level of goodness? Yet, what if this isn't a checklist of virtues for us regular humans to follow at all? What if instead the Beatitudes offer us nothing less than a glimpse of heaven? A vision of the heaven to come and a vision of what could be heaven now. Heaven now, if we let God love and activate and utilize us into making it happen. So it wouldn't happen through us striving to achieve personal feats of goodness. We all know how long that I'm going to be good now kind of goodness lasts, no matter how hard we try. Instead, it would happen, it could happen, it can happen through letting ourselves be loved and guided by God, by saying yes to God, to God's grace in our lives, grace that's waiting there all along, just waiting for us to feel it. If our current suffering is not unprecedented, but in fact precedented, here's one precedent: the life of Julian of Norwich. She wasn't a saint, not officially anyway, not a nun living in a convent or a hermit off in the wilderness, but an anchorite, a religious person who lived in isolation, attached to a church, in her case, St. Julian's Church of Norwich. So Julian, she took the name of the church, lived sealed into a cell called an anchor hold. I like that. With one window opening to the church and the other window opening to the world. And all we really know is that she lived a life of prayer and writing and listening to pilgrims and townspeople who visited her window on the world for comfort and advice. Is this starting to sound a little bit familiar? Maybe in this COVID era, you, like Julian, are living an isolated life. And maybe your computer screen is your window into the church and your window into the world. Maybe you are living in an anchor hold too. And what about COVID as it relates to Julian of Norwich? Well, it was the bubonic plague, striking first when she was just an 8-year-old girl and wiping out half the population. Can you imagine seeing that? Then a second wave, 12 years later, killing another 20%. Can you imagine growing up in the midst of such trauma in the streets, trauma in the homes, watching half the world die? How would it define you? One window into the church, the other facing outward toward the world, and in her anchor hold, in her isolation, through visions, Julian grew to understand the magnitude of God's motherly and fatherly love and compassion for us, and she wanted us to understand God's boundless love and care too, so that realizing that we are in the presence of God's endless love and forgiveness and grace, we might be able to say yes. In a time of suffering, Julian of Norwich lived in isolation. We know what that feels like, so many of us, don't we? not the essential workers, but the people over 65 and many others of us as well. She actually met God there in her isolation and wants us to meet God too. And she puts it this way. She says, it is his will that we should know him and his pleasure that we should rest in him. Then we shall have no further wants. Meanwhile, his will is that we go on knowing and loving until we are perfected in heaven. The more clearly the soul sees the blessed face by grace and love, the more it longs to see it in its fullness. Yearning for union with God in heaven, we start to build our way there now. Julian is talking about the process of living into our sainthood through connecting with God so that we can help bring about that heavenly world described in the Beatitudes, that heavenly kingdom, God's kingdom on earth now. This is what saints have been trying to do down through the ages, like Julian of Norwich, by saying yes to God. They and we participate in the process of perfecting ourselves by God's grace, heading in the right direction by God's grace, even in the midst of suffering, sometimes especially in the midst of suffering. And yes, it's an ongoing process. Right now, in this moment, not unprecedented, but hard and lonely and frightening all the same. We need all the saints. On this All Saints' Day, we need all the saints because everything they learned, everything they got right, their questions, and also their doubts and their colossal blunders, their uncertainty, their fears, their stories. Well, that's us too. We follow them along the bumpy road of learning to say yes to God. We are far from perfect now, but we glimpse heaven, don't we? We glimpse heaven in those we love. You know, for church school this morning, which is called the Schoolhouse, and you can visit it and worship there online, I asked our teacher, Bryna, and her husband, Kent, to make a little video and talk about the saints that inspired them. Both chose living ones. Both said, oh, that's easy. My mother. Who are your saints? Amen.